The leather notebook fell from behind our bedroom dresser, with a soft thud that would forever divide my life into before and after. I had been searching for my missing earring, the small diamond studs my grandmother had given me, when I accidentally knocked over a stack of Kevin's old medical textbooks. That's when I saw it, a journal I'd never noticed before, wedged in the narrow space between furniture and wall. When I opened it to see if it belonged to him, the first line made my blood freeze. Day 1 of the greatest performance of my life begins tomorrow. Surgery is scheduled for 8 a.m., but the real show starts when I wake up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled as I sank onto our unmade bed, the morning sunlight streaming through Portland's gray October sky, seeming to dim around me. For 10 months I had been the devoted wife of a brain surgery patient, carefully managing every aspect of Kevin's recovery after his tumor removal. 10 months of patient explanation when he claimed confusion, gentle assistance when he struggled with basic tasks, endless encouragement during his supposed cognitive rehabilitation. 10 months of his mother telling me how fortunate Kevin was to have such a dedicated caregiver, how not every woman could handle the challenges of loving someone whose personality had been fundamentally altered by medical trauma. But as I continued reading, my entire reality cracked apart like ice under sudden pressure. The journal entries painted a picture so methodically cruel that I had to read each page twice to believe what I was seeing. Kevin hadn't suffered personality changes from his surgery. He had researched them, practiced them, and performed them with the dedication of a method actor preparing for the role of a lifetime. The benign tumor that had required removal was real, but minor. A simple outpatient procedure that should have had him back to normal within weeks. Instead, Kevin had transformed his recovery into an elaborate deception designed to fundamentally restructure our entire life together. Consulted with Dr. Martinez about extending my recovery timeline, read one entry from 2 weeks after his surgery. Explained that I'm experiencing significant cognitive difficulties and will need at least 6 months of intensive support. He seemed concerned but agreed to document my limitations for the insurance claims. The disability payments will give me the financial cushion I need while Chloe handles all the responsibilities I'm tired of managing. I felt physically sick as the implications settled over me. The confusion Kevin displayed when trying to pay bills wasn't genuine bewilderment. It was calculated avoidance. The memory lapses he demonstrated weren't symptoms of brain trauma, but deliberate strategies to shift every burden of adult life onto my shoulder. The childlike dependency he'd developed wasn't the result of neurological damage, but a carefully crafted performance designed to make me feel essential while slowly erasing my own autonomy. Our small apartment suddenly felt like a crime scene. Every interaction from the past 10 months took on a sinister new meaning. When Kevin had tearfully apologized for forgetting our anniversary, claiming the surgery had disrupted his ability to track important dates, he had been following a script he'd written weeks in advance. When he'd asked me to handle phone calls because his speech felt jumbled and embarrassing, he was orchestrating my isolation from the outside world. When he'd collapsed during what should have been a simple grocery shopping trip, forcing me to leave my job early to care for him, he had been executing a calculated manipulation designed to make me choose between my career and his well-being. The journal revealed the methodical nature of his planning with documentation that would have impressed a research scientist. Kevin had spent hours studying the symptoms of various types of brain injury, identifying which ones he could mimic convincingly and which ones might be too difficult to maintain long-term. He'd practiced his confused expressions in the bathroom mirror, timing his hesitations and perfecting the slightly vacant look that had convinced even medical professionals that his cognitive abilities were genuinely compromised. The key is consistency without overperformance. He'd written in neat handwriting that contradicted his claims of coordination problems. Too much confusion, and they'll want more intensive testing. Too little, and Chloe might start questioning whether I really need this level of support. The sweet spot is mild to moderate impairment. That makes me sympathetic but not suspicious. More disturbing were his observations about my responses to his performance. Kevin had been documenting my emotional reactions, noting which of his behaviors triggered the most protective instincts, and which ones made me feel most needed. He'd written detailed analyses of how to make me feel guilty when I showed signs of frustration, how to deflect my questions when I expressed concern about his lack of progress, and how to manufacture medical crises that would reinforce his narrative of being fragile and dependent. Chloe's starting to suggest that maybe I should try driving again, read one entry from 6 months after his surgery. Time to have a coordination episode that scares her enough to drop the subject for a few more weeks. Might stage a minor fall in the kitchen, nothing that could actually hurt me, but enough to make her worry about leaving me alone too often. I remembered that fall, the crash of dishes, Kevin's confused apologies, his insistence that he was fine despite the obvious trembling in his hand. I had held him while he cried about feeling useless, promising that we would get through this together, that I didn't mind taking care of everything while he focused on healing. The memory of my own compassion now felt like evidence of my stupidity. But the financial dimensions of Kevin's deception were perhaps the most shocking. The disability insurance that was paying him 70% of his former salary wasn't supporting our household expenses as I'd believed. Kevin had opened a separate account where those payments accumulated, untouched by the daily costs of rent, groceries and medical co-pays that were draining my own earnings. According to his meticulous records, he had accumulated nearly $40,000 while I struggled to manage our basic needs on my reduced income. Chloe's been picking up extra freelance projects to cover the shortfall from my reduced contributions, he'd noted with apparent satisfaction. She thinks my disability payments barely cover my medications and therapy sessions. In reality, I haven't had a legitimate medical expense in months. Doc Martinez keeps scheduling follow-up appointments I don't actually need, but I let him run his tests since it reinforces the narrative that my condition requires ongoing monitoring. The casual cruelty of his observations made me feel nauseated. Kevin had been studying me like a specimen, documenting my sacrifices as if they were data points in an experiment rather than evidence of love and commitment. He'd noted how I'd given up social activities to spend evenings helping him with cognitive exercises that he didn't need. He'd recorded my concerns about our financial situation with the detached interest of someone observing an interesting psychological phenomenon, rather than the worry of a partner trying to hold their household together. Most devastating were his plans for the future, laid out in entries that revealed the true scope of his deception. Kevin wasn't performing brain injury symptoms indefinitely. This was phase one of a larger strategy designed to give him complete freedom while ensuring I felt too guilty to abandon him. Once he had accumulated enough disability payments and established a solid medical record of cognitive impairment, he intended to convince me that his condition required residential care that would be too emotionally and financially demanding for me to provide at home. The transition to assisted living will be the perfect solution, he'd written with obvious excitement. Chloe will feel terrible about placing me somewhere, but I'll reassure her that it's the loving thing to do. Once I'm officially in care, I'll have access to the accumulated disability funds, plus freedom from the constant performance of being impaired. I can travel, start the photography business I've always wanted, maybe even relocate somewhere with better weather and new opportunities. Kevin had researched specific facilities, calculated costs, and identified which ones would be most conducive to his secret plan. The assisted living community he'd selected was known for its independent living options and relaxed supervision, perfect for someone who needed to maintain the appearance of requiring care while actually living with complete autonomy. He'd even identified a storage unit where he'd been accumulating professional camera equipment and travel gear purchased with his disability payments, preparing for the life he planned to begin once he'd successfully convinced me to commit him to care. The psychological manipulation required to execute such a plan was staggering in its sophistication. Kevin had been slowly conditioning me to believe that caring for him was both my obligation and my primary source of purpose. He'd manufactured crises that made me feel heroic for managing them, created dependencies that made me feel essential, and expressed gratitude that made me feel valued in ways I'd never experienced before our marriage. The journal revealed his understanding that I had entered our relationship with some insecurity about my own worth, and his systematic exploitation of those vulnerabilities to ensure my complete devotion to his well-being. Chloe's self-worth has become entirely tied to being my caregiver, he'd observed with clinical detachment. She talks about her graphic design work less frequently, and seems most animated when discussing strategies for supporting my recovery. This is perfect for the long-term plan. By the time I'm ready for phase 2, she'll be psychologically invested in being the devoted wife who makes the sacrifice of placing her husband in professional care rather than the abandoned spouse whose husband chose freedom over marriage. Reading those words felt like discovering that someone had been surgically removing pieces of my identity while I slept, so gradually that I hadn't noticed the theft until almost nothing remained. Kevin was right about the changes in my sense of self. I had abandoned career opportunities to accommodate his supposed limitations, declined social invitations to stay home with him during his bad days, and restructured my entire life around the needs of someone who had been calculating how to exploit my dedication while planning his eventual escape from our marriage. The journal contained practical details that revealed the extent of Kevin's planning and the coldness of his calculation. He'd identified lawyers who specialized in disability rights, not to protect his legitimate interests, but to ensure his fraudulent claims would be difficult to challenge. He'd researched the legal requirements for involuntary commitment to ensure that his transition to assisted living would appear to be my decision rather than his preference. He'd even investigated the divorce laws in Oregon to determine how his status as a disabled spouse would affect property division and alimony calculations, when he eventually chose to end our marriage from a position of legal advantage. Most chilling were his backup plans for managing potential discoveries of his deception. Kevin had prepared explanations for various scenarios, including what he called Chloe's suspicion management. If I began questioning his symptoms, he was ready to stage a medical emergency that would reinforce his vulnerability. If I suggested he was capable of more independence than he claimed, he had a strategy for introducing new limitations that would justify his continued dependence. If I discovered any evidence of his secret preparations, he had convinced himself that his elaborate medical documentation would make me appear to be an abusive caregiver who was denying necessary support to her disabled husband.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The final entries in the journal revealed Kevin's growing confidence in his deception and his excitement about implementing the next phase of his plan. Just days before I found his hidden notebook, he had written about his intention to begin displaying signs of increased agitation and confusion that would support his transition to residential care within the next few months. He'd already contacted the assisted living facility to inquire about availability and had scheduled a consultation disguised as research for future planning that I thought demonstrated his admirable acceptance of his limitations. Everything is falling into place exactly as I hoped, his most recent entry concluded. Chloe is completely convinced of my cognitive impairment and emotionally invested in supporting my care. The financial foundation is solid, the medical documentation is comprehensive, and the legal groundwork is established. In 6 months I'll be free to start the life I actually want while she believes she's making a loving sacrifice for my well-being. The performance has been exhausting, but the payoff will make it worthwhile. Sitting in our bedroom with the journal spread across my lap, I felt the full weight of 10 months of systematic psychological manipulation settle over me like a suffocating blanket. Kevin hadn't just lied about his medical condition, he had orchestrated a complete transformation of my identity, my relationships, my career and my sense of reality. The man I had been caring for with such devotion didn't exist and never had. The future I thought we were building together was actually his calculated plan for abandoning me while making me complicit in my own abandonment. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else emerged from beneath the pain and humiliation. A cold, clear anger that felt more focused than any emotion I had ever experienced. Kevin had underestimated me in ways that would prove to be catastrophic for his carefully constructed plan. He had assumed that my compassion made me weak, that my dedication made me stupid, and that my love made me blind to evidence that contradicted what I wanted to believe. He was about to discover just how wrong those assumptions had been. The journal had revealed Kevin's deception, but it had also provided me with something infinitely more valuable, a complete blueprint of his strategy, his timeline, his resources, and his vulnerability. Every detail he had documented to ensure the success of his manipulation would become evidence of his fraud. Every psychological insight he had recorded to exploit my weaknesses would help me understand exactly how to dismantle his deception. Kevin had spent 10 months learning how to manipulate me, but he had also inadvertently provided me with everything I needed to destroy him. The performance was about to have a very different ending than the one he had planned. The first person I called was Helen Patterson, our elderly neighbor from across the hall. Helen was 73 years old, a retired registered nurse who had worked in neurological rehabilitation for over 4 decades before moving to Portland to be closer to her daughter. She had been one of the few people who consistently checked on Kevin during his supposed recovery, often bringing homemade soup and offering professional insights about his progress that I had gratefully accepted as validation of my caregiving effort. What I hadn't realized was that Helen had been documenting her own concerns about Kevin's condition for months, driven by inconsistencies she observed that didn't align with her extensive medical experience. When I called her that afternoon, my voice barely steady enough to ask if we could speak privately, Helen immediately invited me to her apartment and put on a pot of coffee with the efficiency of someone who recognized a crisis in progress. Helen's living room was filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life well lived, but what caught my attention was the neat stack of notebooks on her coffee table. When I explained what I had discovered about Kevin's deception, Helen nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone whose professional instincts had finally been validated. I knew something wasn't right, she said, reaching for the top note. His symptoms never followed any pattern I recognized from genuine brain injury cases. The inconsistencies were too convenient, too perfectly timed to avoid responsibilities he didn't want to handle. Helen opened her notebook to reveal months of careful observations that painted a devastating picture of Kevin's deception from an independent medical perspective. She had documented times when Kevin displayed perfect coordination while performing tasks he enjoyed, immediately followed by confusion and clumsiness when asked to help with household responsibility. She had noted his ability to follow complex television storylines and engage in detailed conversations about subjects that interested him, contrasted with his claimed inability to manage simple scheduling or financial decisions. Last Tuesday I watched him parallel park your car with absolute precision, Helen continued, showing me a dated entry with precise timestamp. 20 minutes later, when you asked him to help bring groceries upstairs, he claimed dizziness and coordination problems that made climbing stairs dangerous. No legitimate brain injury creates that kind of selective impairment. Helen's medical expertise provided context that transformed Kevin's performance from convincing deception into obvious fraud. She explained how genuine cognitive rehabilitation followed predictable patterns of improvement and setback, how real coordination problems manifested consistently across different types of activities, and how authentic memory issues created specific types of confusion that Kevin had never displayed. The most telling sign was his emotional responses, Helen observed. Patients with genuine cognitive impairment typically show appropriate frustration or sadness about their limitations. Kevin displayed what we call theatrical distress, exaggerated emotional reactions designed to elicit sympathy rather than genuine feelings about lost ability. Helen had also been documenting Kevin's activities during the hours when I thought he was resting or struggling with basic self-care. Her apartment window provided a clear view of the building's parking area, and she had observed Kevin making multiple trips to his car carrying items that suggested far more independence and planning than his supposed condition should have allowed. He's been loading camping equipment, photography gear, and boxes of what appeared to be important documents, she explained, showing me photographs taken with a telephoto lens that revealed Kevin's completely normal physical capability. Last week I watched him assemble a complex hiking tent in the parking lot, then disassemble it and pack everything away with the efficiency of someone whose fine motor skills are perfectly intact. The photographs were devastating evidence that Kevin had been living an entirely separate life during the hours when I believed he was struggling with basic cognitive and physical tasks. Helen had captured images of him reading detailed instruction manuals, manipulating small mechanical components, and organizing equipment with the kind of systematic precision that contradicted every limitation he had claimed to experience. But Helen's observations extended beyond Kevin's secret activities, to include his interactions with other residents of our apartment building. She had documented conversations where Kevin displayed perfect social awareness, appropriate humor, and complete cognitive clarity when he thought I was safely away at work or occupied with errands that would keep me busy for extended periods. He had a 15-minute conversation with Miss Shen about investment strategies, Helen noted, referring to our neighbor who worked as a financial advisor. Kevin demonstrated detailed understanding of market trends, retirement planning, and complex financial instruments. This was the same week he claimed he couldn't understand our basic household budget and needed you to manage all monetary decisions. Helen's willingness to help expose Kevin's deception stemmed not just from professional outrage about disability fraud, but from personal anger about the systematic psychological abuse she had witnessed him inflicting on me. As a healthcare professional, she understood the devastating impact of caregiver burnout and had watched with growing concern as I sacrificed my own well-being to support someone who was secretly exploiting my dedication. You've lost weight, stopped seeing friends, given up professional opportunities, and developed the kind of chronic stress symptoms I used to see in family members of legitimately disabled patients, Helen explained. The difference is that those caregivers were making real sacrifices for genuine needs. You've been manipulated into destroying your own life to enable Kevin's elaborate deception. Helen's apartment became our unofficial headquarters for planning Kevin's exposure. Her medical background provided credibility that would be essential when presenting evidence to authorities, while her systematic documentation offered independent verification of Kevin's fraud that couldn't be dismissed as the vindictive accusations of an angry spouse. Within hours of our initial conversation, Helen had contacted 2 former colleagues who specialized in disability fraud investigation. Dr. Sarah Chen worked for the State Insurance Commission, and had extensive experience identifying malingering and disability claims. Detective Robert Martinez had spent 15 years investigating healthcare fraud and understood the legal requirements for building prosecutable cases against sophisticated medical deception. The key is establishing a clear pattern of intentional deception rather than genuine symptom variability, Dr. Chen explained during our first meeting at Helen's apartment. Kevin's journal provides the intent, Helen's observations provide the behavioral evidence, and your documentation of his supposed limitations provides the contrast necessary to prove deliberate fraud. Dr. Chen outlined the systematic approach we would need to take in order to build a case that would satisfy both insurance investigators and criminal prosecutors. Kevin's disability fraud was a felony that carried serious prison time, but only if we could prove that his symptoms were deliberately fabricated rather than genuinely experienced and inconsistently reported. Medical malingering cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute because the difference between exaggerated symptoms and manufactured symptoms can be subtle, Dr. Chen warned. We need evidence that Kevin was capable of normal function while specifically claiming impairment, not just evidence that his recovery was inconsistent or slower than expected. Detective Martinez focused on the financial dimensions of Kevin's fraud and the legal procedures required to freeze assets that had been accumulated through fraudulent disability claims. The storage unit Helen had observed Kevin visiting represented potential evidence of his secret preparations, but accessing it would require careful coordination with law enforcement to ensure that any discovered evidence would be admissible in court. The journal gives us probable cause, but we need to document ongoing deception in real time to demonstrate that this isn't a historical problem he's outgrown, Detective Martinez explained. If Kevin has genuinely recovered from his original symptoms but simply failed to report his improvement, that's a different legal issue than active ongoing fraud with intent to permanently deceive insurance providers and family members. Our strategy required continued surveillance of Kevin's activities, combined with careful documentation of his continued performance of disability symptoms in my presence.
Helen would maintain her photographic record of his normal functioning during independent activities, while I would document his claimed limitations during our daily interactions. The psychological challenge of maintaining my role as the devoted caregiver while secretly gathering evidence of Kevin's deception was more difficult than I had anticipated. Every solicitous inquiry about his well-being, every gentle assistance with tasks he claimed to find confusing, every expression of sympathy for his struggles felt like participating in my own abuse while collecting evidence of the abuse itself. Kevin seemed to interpret my increased attentiveness as validation that his performance was succeeding. His journal entries during this period revealed his satisfaction with what he perceived as my growing emotional investment in his care, and my increasing isolation from independent activities that might interfere with my caregiving responsibility. Chloe's been extra nurturing lately, he wrote in an entry I discovered during one of his therapy walks. She seems more committed than ever to supporting my recovery and less interested in resuming the social activities that used to distract her from focusing on my needs. The transition to residential care is going to be even easier than I anticipated because she's becoming psychologically dependent on being my primary caregiver. Kevin's misinterpretation of my behavior revealed the narcissistic blindness that made his eventual exposure inevitable. He was so convinced of his own manipulative skills that he couldn't imagine I might be capable of deception myself, or that my increased attention might stem from suspicion rather than devotion. His confidence in his performance made him careless about maintaining consistency, providing us with increasingly obvious evidence of his fraud. Helen's medical connections proved invaluable in establishing the foundation for Kevin's exposure. Chen arranged for an independent neurological evaluation that would be presented to Kevin as routine follow-up care recommended by his insurance provider, but would actually consist of specialized tests designed to identify malingering and deliberate symptom fabrication. Williams has 40 years of experience in neurological assessment and has served as an expert witness in dozens of disability fraud cases, Dr. Chen explained. He knows exactly how to design evaluations that distinguish between genuine cognitive impairment and performed limitation. Kevin won't be able to maintain his deception under that level of professional scrutiny. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week, giving us time to coordinate our documentation efforts and ensure that Kevin's exposure would occur under controlled circumstances that maximize the legal admissibility of evidence while minimizing his opportunity to destroy incriminating materials or flee before authorities could secure his asset. Detective Martinez obtained authorization to place monitoring equipment in our apartment building's common areas, allowing law enforcement to document Kevin's normal physical capabilities during the periods when he moved freely through spaces where he thought his activities were unobserved. The storage unit he had been visiting would be placed under surveillance to document his ongoing accumulation of equipment and supplies inconsistent with his claimed disabilities. Once we have comprehensive evidence of his fraud, everything happens very quickly, Detective Martinez warned. Kevin will be arrested, his assets will be frozen, and his disability benefits will be immediately suspended pending investigation. You need to be prepared for his reaction when he realizes that his deception has been discovered and that he's facing serious criminal charges. Helen arranged for me to stay in her apartment during the initial phases of Kevin's exposure, recognizing that his response to discovery might include attempts to intimidate me into recanting my accusations or refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. Her medical background had taught her that people capable of elaborate psychological manipulation often became dangerous when their control was threatened. Kevin spent months conditioning you to prioritize his well-being over your own safety and interests, Helen observed. When he realizes that his manipulation has failed and that you've been documenting his deception, he may try to convince you that exposing him would be cruel or vindictive rather than justified. You need to be psychologically prepared to maintain your resolve even when he's desperate. The days leading up to Kevin's neurological evaluation were surreal in their normalcy. He continued his performance of cognitive confusion and physical limitation while I maintained my role as the devoted caregiver, both of us playing characters in a domestic drama that was about to reach its final act. Kevin seemed pleased with what he interpreted as my increased dedication to his care, writing journal entries that revealed his excitement about implementing the next phase of his plan. Chloe started researching assisted living facilities, he noted with obvious satisfaction. She thinks she's being proactive about planning for my potential future needs, but she's actually doing the preliminary work for my transition to independence. By the time I'm ready to move forward, she'll have already identified the perfect facility and convinced herself that residential care is the loving choice rather than abandonment. Kevin's confidence in his manipulation was about to encounter the reality of systematic evidence gathering conducted by medical and legal professionals who understood exactly how to expose sophisticated deception. His journal had provided the roadmap for his own destruction, while his underestimation of my capabilities had blinded him to the comprehensive case being built around his fraud. The performance that had consumed 10 months of our lives was about to reach its conclusion, but the ending would be very different from the one Kevin had scripted for himself. The neurological evaluation was scheduled for Thursday morning at Portland General Hospital, and Kevin seemed genuinely excited about what he believed would be another opportunity to reinforce his disability narrative. Williams had specifically requested comprehensive testing that would require Kevin to demonstrate his cognitive and physical capabilities across multiple domains, ostensibly to assess his progress and determine appropriate treatment modification. Kevin spent Wednesday evening preparing for his performance with the same methodical approach he had used throughout his deception. I watched him practice his hesitant speech patterns in the bathroom mirror, rehearse his coordination difficulties by deliberately fumbling with simple objects, and review his fabricated symptom timeline to ensure consistency with his previous medical reports. I want to make sure Williams understands that I'm still struggling with basic tasks, Kevin explained to me as he prepared for bed. Sometimes I worry that I'm getting better at hiding my difficulties, and I don't want him to think I'm more recovered than I actually am. The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming. Kevin was indeed getting better at hiding something, but it wasn't his difficulties, it was his complete normalcy. His concern about appearing too functional was actually a calculated strategy to maintain his fraud while preventing any medical professional from discovering that his symptoms were entirely fabricated. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of late autumn in Portland, and Kevin maintained his performance throughout our drive to the hospital. He asked me to help him with his seatbelt, claimed confusion about which building we needed to enter, and displayed the kind of hesitant navigation through familiar spaces that had become his signature symptom during medical appointments. Doc Williams met us in his office with the professional warmth that concealed his expertise in identifying malingering. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s whose calm demeanor and gentle questioning style had convinced hundreds of patients to reveal the truth about their actual capabilities during seemingly routine evaluation. Kevin, I understand you've been experiencing some ongoing challenges since your surgery, Dr. Williams began, consulting notes that I knew contained detailed information about the inconsistencies Helen and our investigative team had documented. Today we're going to do some comprehensive testing to get a clearer picture of your current functioning. The evaluation began with standard cognitive assessments that Kevin approached with his practiced confusion. He deliberately answered questions incorrectly, claimed difficulty understanding instructions, and displayed the kind of effortful concentration that suggested significant cognitive impairment. Williams made careful notes about Kevin's responses while maintaining an encouraging demeanor that gave no indication of his actual purpose. These next tests will assess your coordination and fine motor skills, Williams explained, introducing a series of tasks that appeared straightforward but were actually designed to identify deliberate poor performance. Don't worry about doing them perfectly, we just want to see how you manage these activities. Kevin's approach to the physical assessments revealed the sophisticated nature of his deception. He had clearly studied the symptoms of various neurological conditions and developed a performance that incorporated elements from multiple disorders, while avoiding any single pattern that might be easily identified as fabricated. His coordination problems were inconsistent in ways that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than genuine impairment. What Kevin didn't realize was that Dr. Williams had administered thousands of these evaluations and could distinguish between authentic neurological symptoms and performed limitations with remarkable precision. Genuine brain injury created specific patterns of difficulty that were virtually impossible to fake convincingly, while deliberate poor performance followed predictable patterns that trained specialists could identify reliably. Kevin, I'd like you to try walking in a straight line while counting backwards from 100, Dr. Williams requested, positioning himself to observe Kevin's movement patterns from multiple angles. Take your time and don't worry if you need to stop and restart. Kevin's performed gait instability incorporated wobbling and hesitation that looked convincing to an untrained observer, but followed none of the biomechanical patterns associated with genuine neurological damage. His counting was deliberately slow and included calculated errors that suggested cognitive impairment while actually demonstrating his ability to perform complex mental tasks while simultaneously managing physical coordination. Williams documented Kevin's performance with the systematic precision of someone building a comprehensive record of deliberate deception. Each test revealed new evidence that Kevin's limitations were performed rather than experienced, from the way he struggled with tasks that required skills he had demonstrated normally in Helen's surveillance videos to his consistent ability to perform complex cognitive operations while claiming simple confusion. The evaluation extended over 3 hours, during which Kevin maintained his performance with remarkable consistency. Williams tested his memory, problem-solving abilities, language processing, visual spatial skills, and physical coordination through assessments that grew progressively more sophisticated in their ability to distinguish genuine impairment from malingering. We're almost finished, Kevin, Williams said near the end of the session. I have just a few more questions about your daily functioning and then we'll review everything together. The final phase of the evaluation involved detailed questioning about Kevin's activities, limitations, and support needs that was designed to identify inconsistencies between his claimed capabilities and his actual behavior. Williams asked about specific scenarios that Helen's surveillance had documented, presenting them as hypothetical situations while observing Kevin's responses. If you needed to load heavy camping equipment into your car, how would you manage that task given your current coordination difficulty? Dr. Williams asked, referring directly to activities Helen had photographed Kevin performing with perfect competence. Kevin's response revealed his confidence in his deception and his complete unawareness that his secret activities had been documented. I couldn't handle something like that, he replied with practiced helplessness. My balance problems and coordination issues would make it too dangerous. Chloe has to help me with anything heavier than a few pounds. Williams made careful notes about Kevin's response while maintaining his neutral expression. The evaluation concluded with Kevin believing he had successfully reinforced his disability narrative while actually providing comprehensive evidence of his fraud to a medical expert who specialized in exposing exactly this type of deception. After Kevin was dismissed to the waiting room, Williams met privately with me to discuss his findings. His assessment was unambiguous and damning. Kevin is malingering, Dr. Williams stated with clinical precision. His symptom presentation follows none of the patterns associated with genuine neurological impairment from the type of surgery he underwent. Every aspect of his performance suggests deliberate fabrication designed to appear convincing to non-specialists. Dr. Williams explained how Kevin's responses during testing revealed his actual capabilities while demonstrating his deliberate attempts to appear impaired. The coordination tasks had shown that Kevin possessed normal balance, fine motor control, and spatial awareness that he was actively suppressing during evaluation. His cognitive assessments revealed intact memory, processing speed, and problem-solving abilities that contradicted every limitation he had claimed to experience. The most telling evidence is the pattern of his errors, Dr. Williams continued. Genuine cognitive impairment creates specific types of mistakes that reflect underlying neurological damage. Kevin's errors were inconsistent with any known pattern of brain injury, but perfectly consistent with someone who understands normal cognitive function and is deliberately performing poorly. Williams had documented sufficient evidence to support criminal prosecution for disability fraud, and his report would provide the medical foundation necessary to demonstrate that Kevin's symptoms were fabricated rather than genuinely experienced. The evaluation had effectively ended Kevin's ability to maintain his deception in any medical or legal context. While Dr. Williams prepared his report, Detective Martinez was executing search warrants for Kevin's storage unit and secret financial account. The timing had been coordinated to ensure that Kevin would be occupied during the medical evaluation while law enforcement secured evidence that would prevent him from destroying incriminating materials once his fraud was exposed. The storage unit contained overwhelming evidence of Kevin's deception and his preparation for abandoning our marriage. Photography equipment worth thousands of dollars sat alongside camping gear, travel documents, and boxes of personal items that Kevin had been gradually removing from our apartment. Most damaging was a folder containing detailed research about assisted living facilities, legal documents related to disability benefits, and correspondence with real estate agents about properties in other states. Detective Martinez also discovered a second journal that contained Kevin's more detailed planning for his post-fraud life. Unlike the journal I had found in our bedroom, this one focused on his practical preparations for starting over with his accumulated disability payments in a location where no one would know about his fabricated medical history. Kevin had researched everything from new identity documents to strategies for establishing residency in states with different disability benefit verification requirements. Detective Martinez explained when he called to update me on their findings. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud, it was a comprehensive plan for permanent escape from his current life using stolen money. The financial investigation revealed that Kevin had accumulated nearly $60,000 in disability payments while hiding additional assets in accounts I had never known existed. His total theft from insurance providers exceeded the felony threshold by a substantial margin, ensuring that his prosecution would carry significant prison time even with a plea agreement. By Thursday afternoon, Kevin's fraud had been comprehensively documented by medical, legal, and financial experts who specialized in exactly this type of sophisticated deception. His journal provided evidence of intent. Williams's evaluation proved his symptoms were fabricated. Helen's surveillance demonstrated his normal functioning, and the storage unit revealed his preparation for permanent escape. Kevin remained completely unaware that his deception had been exposed. During our drive home from the hospital, he seemed pleased with his performance and optimistic about maintaining his disability benefits while implementing the next phase of his plan. Williams seemed satisfied with the evaluation, Kevin told me, apparently interpreting the doctor's professional neutrality as validation of his symptoms. I think he understands that my recovery is going to be a long process and that I'll need continued support for the foreseeable future. That evening, Kevin made a journal entry that would become evidence in his prosecution. Medical evaluation went perfectly. Convinced Dr. Williams that my limitations are genuine and ongoing. Chloe remains completely supportive and seems more committed than ever to providing the care I need. The transition to residential care should proceed smoothly over the next few months, especially now that I have updated medical documentation supporting my disability status. Kevin's confidence in his deception made the contrast with reality even more stark. While he celebrated what he believed was another successful performance, law enforcement was finalizing arrest warrants, prosecutors were reviewing evidence for multiple felony charges, and insurance investigators were preparing to freeze his assets and recover stolen funds. Friday morning brought a call from Dr. Chen confirming that all elements of the case were ready for implementation. Kevin's arrest was scheduled for Monday morning to allow time for final coordination between all involved agencies, and to ensure that his exposure would occur under circumstances that maximized both legal effectiveness and personal safety. Everything happened simultaneously, Dr. Chen explained. Kevin will be arrested on multiple felony charges, his assets will be frozen, his disability benefits will be terminated, and his medical records will be flagged to prevent future fraud attempts. There won't be any opportunity for him to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or flee with stolen money. Helen had arranged for me to stay at her daughter's house during Kevin's arrest and the immediate aftermath. Recognizing that his reaction to discovery might include attempts to blame me for his exposure or to convince me that cooperating with prosecution would be vindictive rather than justified. Kevin's psychological manipulation has been sophisticated and sustained, Helen warned. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his fraud, He may try to convince you that exposing him is cruel or that his deception was somehow justified by circumstances you don't understand. You need to be prepared to maintain your resolve even when he's desperate. The weekend passed with surreal normalcy as Kevin continued his performance while remaining completely unaware that comprehensive evidence of his fraud was being finalized by multiple law enforcement agencies. He seemed particularly pleased with what he interpreted as my increased dedication to his care, writing journal entries that revealed his excitement about implementing the residential care phase of his plan. Sunday evening, Kevin made what would be his final journal entry as a free man. Everything is proceeding exactly according to plan. Medical documentation is solid, financial resources are secure, and Chloe is psychologically prepared for the transition to assisted living. The performance has been challenging, but the outcome will justify every difficult moment. Freedom is finally within reach. Kevin had no idea that Monday morning would bring not freedom but the complete destruction of the elaborate deception that had consumed nearly a year of our lives and stolen thousands of dollars from insurance providers who trusted that his disability claims were legitimate. The performance was about to reach its conclusion, but Kevin would discover that he had been cast as the villain in a story where justice prevailed over manipulation, and where the wife he had systematically deceived proved to be far more formidable than he had ever imagined possible. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Portland feel electric with possibility. I had spent the night at Helen's daughter Sarah's house in the Alberta district, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a family preparing for a typical workday while I prepared for something that felt more like a controlled explosion that would reshape the landscape of my entire existence. Sarah had insisted on making breakfast while her twin daughters argued about homework assignments and her husband searched for misplaced car keys. The normalcy of their morning routine provided a stark contrast to what I knew was about to unfold across town, where Kevin was presumably beginning another day of his elaborate performance while having no idea that law enforcement officers were already positioned outside our apartment building. Detective Martinez called at exactly 8:30 to confirm that all agencies were in position and ready to proceed with Kevin's arrest. The timing had been carefully orchestrated to coincide with Kevin's usual morning routine, when he would be alone in our apartment and therefore unable to involve me in any attempts to explain or minimize his situation. The warrant team is ready to execute, and we have surveillance confirmation that Kevin is alone in the apartment, Detective Martinez reported with professional efficiency. Insurance investigators are standing by to freeze his accounts, and Williams has provided his final assessment, confirming systematic mail injury.
Are you prepared for what happens next? The question seemed almost surreal given the months of preparation that had led to this moment, but I understood what Detective Martinez was really asking. Once Kevin's arrest began, there would be no possibility of retreat or reconsideration. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal machinery was in motion, and Kevin's fraud would be exposed publicly in ways that would permanently destroy his ability to maintain his deception with family, friends, or future victims. "I'm ready," I said, and discovered that I genuinely meant it. Kevin's arrest unfolded with the methodical precision of a coordinated law enforcement operation. Detective Martinez maintained radio contact with me throughout the process, providing updates that transformed Kevin's exposure from an abstract concept into vivid reality. "Suspect is answering the door and appears confused by law enforcement presence," came the first report. "He's maintaining his performance of cognitive impairment and asking for his wife to be present for any questioning." Kevin's attempt to use his fabricated symptoms as protection against arrest revealed both his continued confidence in his deception and his complete failure to understand that his fraud had been comprehensively documented by experts who specialized in identifying exactly this type of manipulation. "Suspect is being informed of charges and appears genuinely shocked," Detective Martinez reported 15 minutes later. "He's insisting there's been some mistake and demanding to speak with his neurologist to verify his disability status." The irony of Kevin's response was overwhelming. The neurologist he wanted to contact for verification was Dr. Williams, whose evaluation had provided definitive evidence that Kevin's symptoms were deliberately fabricated. Kevin's confidence in his medical deception had blinded him to the possibility that medical professionals might be more sophisticated in their assessment techniques than he was in his performance ability. "Suspect is being arrested on charges of insurance fraud, disability fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud," came the final report from the apartment. "He's requesting permission to contact his wife and expressing concern about who will provide his care while he's in custody." Kevin's concern about his care arrangements during legal proceedings demonstrated the depth of his psychological investment in his own deception. Even while being arrested for fabricating his symptoms,
he continued to maintain the fiction that he required specialized support for managing daily activities. His performance had become so integral to his identity that he couldn't abandon it even when facing criminal prosecution. The search of our apartment yielded additional evidence that strengthened the case against Kevin while revealing the full scope of his deception. Law enforcement discovered multiple journals documenting different aspects of his fraud, correspondence with assisted living facilities that contradicted his claims of cognitive impairment, and financial records showing systematic accumulation of disability payments while hiding his actual expenses from. Most damaging was Kevin's detailed research into legal strategies for protecting assets during divorce proceedings, including specific plans for using his disability status to claim additional support while minimizing his financial obligations. The documents revealed that Kevin's fraud extended beyond simple theft of insurance money to include calculated preparation for abandoning our marriage while maximizing his financial advantage and minimizing my ability to seek appropriate settlement. Detective Martinez arrived at Sarah's house within hours of Kevin's arrest, carrying boxes of evidence that illustrated the systematic nature of Kevin's deception in the comprehensive case that prosecutors would present against him. The documentation was overwhelming in both its volume and its detail, representing nearly a year of methodical planning and execution of a fraud scheme that had destroyed my emotional well-being while enriching Kevin's secret account. Kevin maintained his performance throughout booking and initial questioning. Detective Martinez explained, "He's claiming that his arrest is a misunderstanding and that medical professionals have confirmed his disability status. He apparently doesn't understand that Williams's evaluation was specifically designed to expose his fraud rather than validate his claims." Kevin's continued commitment to his deception while in police custody revealed the narcissistic delusion that had made his fraud possible in the first place. He remained convinced that his performance was convincing enough to deceive trained investigators, medical experts and prosecutors who specialized in identifying sophisticated deception. The insurance investigation proceeded simultaneously with the criminal charges, and Kevin's disability benefits were immediately suspended pending a comprehensive audit of his claims and medical history. Insurance investigators had discovered that Kevin's fraud extended beyond our local providers to include claims submitted in other jurisdictions, suggesting a pattern of deception that predated our marriage. Kevin filed disability claims in 3 different states using variations of his medical history. The insurance investigator explained during a meeting at the prosecutor's office. Each claim emphasized different aspects of his supposed impairment, and the timelines suggest deliberate forum shopping to maximize his fraudulent income while minimizing the risk of detection. The multi-state nature of Kevin's fraud elevated his charges to federal offenses that carried significantly enhanced penalties compared to simple local insurance fraud. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the case for potential prosecution under statutes designed to address sophisticated financial crimes that crossed state boundaries. Kevin's family reacted to his arrest with the kind of shocked denial that suggested they had been genuinely deceived by his performance rather than complicit in his fraud. His mother called me repeatedly, insisting that there had been some terrible mistake and that Kevin's cognitive impairment made him vulnerable to false accusations he couldn't properly defend against. Kevin's condition makes him confused about dates and details, his mother explained during one particularly difficult phone conversation. He might have made mistakes with his paperwork or misunderstood the requirements for reporting his progress, but he would never deliberately defraud anyone. The conversation revealed how thoroughly Kevin had deceived even his closest family members, who had witnessed his supposed symptoms during visits and had developed genuine concern about his cognitive and physical limitations. His mother's protective instincts were based on her sincere belief that Kevin was genuinely disabled and therefore vulnerable to prosecution he couldn't properly understand. Kevin's brother Marcus took a different approach, expressing anger about being unknowingly involved in Kevin's deception through the camping equipment purchases and storage unit arrangements that had been presented as legitimate accommodation of Kevin's disability needs. Kevin convinced me he was using adaptive equipment and modified supplies to maintain some independence despite his limitations, Marcus explained when Detective Martinez interviewed him about his potential knowledge of the fraud. "I thought I was helping my disabled brother maintain some dignity and autonomy, not enabling a criminal scheme." Marcus's cooperation with the investigation provided additional evidence about Kevin's systematic deception of his entire social network. Kevin had manipulated family members, friends, and acquaintances into supporting his fraud through their genuine compassion for someone they believed was struggling with legitimate medical challenges. The prosecutor assigned to Kevin's case was Rebecca Chen,
a specialist in white-collar crime who had extensive experience with disability fraud and financial manipulation cases. She met with me to discuss the prosecution strategy and to prepare me for Kevin's likely legal defense, which would probably involve attempts to minimize his culpability by claiming genuine confusion about his medical status or entitlement to benefit. Kevin's fraud was sophisticated and sustained over an extended period. Prosecutor Chen explained, "The evidence is overwhelming, but defendants in these cases often attempt to generate sympathy by claiming they were genuinely confused about their condition or overwhelmed by complex medical and legal requirements." Prosecutor Chen reviewed the evidence that would be presented against Kevin, from his detailed journals documenting his deliberate deception to Dr. Williams' expert testimony about the impossibility of his symptom presentation being genuine. The case was strong enough to secure conviction even if Kevin maintained his innocence, but prosecutors preferred plea agreements that avoided the expense and uncertainty of lengthy trial. Kevin's attorney will likely recommend a plea agreement once they review the evidence. Prosecutor Chen predicted, "The documentation is too comprehensive and the expert testimony too definitive for any reasonable defense strategy to succeed at trial." Kevin's first court appearance was scheduled for the following week, and I was required to attend as both a victim and a potential witness in the prosecution. The legal process would take months to complete, but Kevin's fraud had been so thoroughly documented that the outcome was essentially predetermined. The psychological impact of Kevin's exposure was more complex than I had anticipated. While I felt vindicated by the validation of my suspicions and grateful for the end of his manipulation, I also experienced unexpected grief for the loss of the marriage I had believed was real, even though it had actually been an elaborate deception. Helen provided crucial emotional support during the adjustment period following Kevin's arrest, helping me understand that grieving for the relationship I had thought I had was normal and healthy rather than a sign of weakness or confusion about Kevin's actual character. "You're mourning the death of someone who never existed," Helen explained with the clinical insight that made her such an effective advocate. "The Kevin you loved and cared for was a fictional character he created to manipulate you. It's natural to feel loss even when you understand that the relationship was based on lies." The media attention surrounding Kevin's case was intense but generally favorable to me as the victim of his elaborate deception. Local news stations interviewed Dr. Williams about the medical aspects of disability fraud, and several articles were published about the warning signs that family members should watch for when someone claims ongoing impairment following medical treatment. This case demonstrates the sophisticated nature of modern insurance fraud and the importance of professional evaluation by specialists who understand malingering detection. Dr. Williams told reporters, "Kevin's deception was elaborate enough to fool most non-professionals, but it followed predictable patterns that trained evaluators can identify reliably." Kevin's case became a training example for insurance investigators, medical professionals and law enforcement personnel who needed to understand how sophisticated fraudsters operated and how their deceptions could be systematically exposed through coordinated investigation. The storage unit contents were cataloged as evidence, revealing the full scope of Kevin's preparation for his post-fraud life. Photography equipment, travel gear, camping supplies, and personal documents painted a picture of someone who had been meticulously planning his escape from our marriage while accumulating the resources necessary to start over elsewhere. Most disturbing were the detailed notes Kevin had made about potential new identities and locations where he planned to establish residency after abandoning his current life. The documents suggested that Kevin had viewed our marriage as a temporary arrangement that provided cover for his fraud while he accumulated sufficient resources to disappear permanently. Kevin had researched everything from new social security numbers to strategies for establishing credit history under assumed names. Detective Martinez explained, "This wasn't just insurance fraud, it was preparation for complete identity abandonment and permanent escape from legal consequence." The federal investigation expanded to include potential charges related to identity fraud and conspiracy to evade prosecution, adding years to Kevin's potential sentence and ensuring that his case would serve as a deterrent to others contemplating similar schemes. By the end of the first week following Kevin's arrest, his fraud had been completely exposed and his elaborate deception had been transformed from a source of personal torment into a comprehensive legal case that would protect other potential victims from similar manipulation. Kevin remained in custody, unable to make bail due to flight risk concerns based on his documented planning for permanent disappearance. The performance that had consumed nearly a year of our lives had finally reached its conclusion, but Kevin would discover that his starring role in this particular drama would continue for several more years in a much less comfortable venue than he had ever imagined. Kevin's plea hearing took place on a rain-soaked Wednesday morning in February,
4 months after his arrest and 3 months into a legal process that had systematically dismantled every aspect of his elaborate fraud. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland felt appropriately solemn for what would be Kevin's final performance. Though this time the audience consisted of federal prosecutors, insurance investigators, and a judge who specialized in complex financial crime. I sat in the gallery watching Kevin shuffle to the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish his physical presence in ways that his fabricated symptoms never had. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Lawson, who had been assigned after Kevin's assets were frozen, carried a briefcase that I knew contained a plea agreement acknowledging guilt on multiple federal charges in exchange for a sentence that would still keep Kevin in prison for the next 6 years. Judge Patricia Nguyen reviewed the charges with methodical precision. Wire fraud, mail fraud, disability fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and identity theft related to his multi-state deception and preparation for permanent disappearance. Each count carried substantial prison time, and the cumulative effect would ensure that Kevin's freedom was measured in years rather than months. Mr. Morrison, do you understand the charges against you and the consequences of entering a guilty plea? Judge Nguyen asked with the formal tone that marked the beginning of Kevin's legal reckoning. Kevin's response revealed that his capacity for performance had finally been exhausted by the reality of federal prosecution. Yes, Your Honor, he said in a voice that carried none of the hesitation or confusion he had maintained for nearly a year of fraudulent disability claim. The plea colloquy proceeded with clinical efficiency as Kevin acknowledged his understanding of each charge and formally admitted guilt to crimes that would define his identity for the remainder of his adult life. The man who had spent months pretending to be confused by simple instructions demonstrated perfect comprehension of complex legal concepts when his freedom depended on accurate understanding. Prosecutor Chen presented a victim impact statement that I had prepared describing the psychological and financial damage Kevin's fraud had inflicted on our marriage and my personal well-being. The statement detailed the months of believing I was caring for a disabled spouse while he secretly planned to abandon me, the professional opportunities I had sacrificed to accommodate his fabricated limitation, the emotional trauma of discovering that our entire relationship had been built around systematic deception. The defendant's fraud extended far beyond simple theft of insurance money. Prosecutor Chen explained to the court he perpetrated sophisticated psychological abuse against his wife by making her believe she was performing acts of love and devotion while he calculated how to exploit her compassion for maximum personal benefit. Kevin's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, allowing time for federal probation officers to complete their investigation into his background and criminal history. The pre-sentence report would document Kevin's fraud in comprehensive detail while assessing his likelihood of rehabilitation and future compliance with legal requirements. Williams provided expert testimony about the medical aspects of Kevin's deception and the sophisticated nature of his malingering performance. His professional assessment would help the court understand that Kevin's fraud required sustained deception that demonstrated clear criminal intent rather than confusion about his actual medical status. The defendant's symptom presentation was deliberately fabricated and maintained over an extended period. Dr. Williams testified, his performance required detailed knowledge of neurological symptoms combined with consistent acting ability that proves he possessed the cognitive capabilities he claimed to have lost. The insurance investigation had recovered most of the money Kevin had stolen, but the process required liquidating his accumulated assets and pursuing civil judgments that would follow him for decades after his release from prison. Kevin's dreams of financial independence had been transformed into permanent debt obligation that would prevent him from benefiting from his crimes. Helen attended the sentencing hearing as a witness whose medical expertise and systematic documentation had been crucial to exposing Kevin's fraud. She sat beside me in the gallery providing moral support while watching the conclusion of a case that had demonstrated the importance of professional skepticism when evaluating unusual medical claims. Kevin's deception was sophisticated enough to fool most people, Helen observed during a recess in the proceedings. The difference was that we approached his claims with systematic investigation rather than accepting them at face value because we wanted to believe he was genuinely struggling. Kevin's mother attended the hearing despite the devastating revelation of her son's true character. She had been forced to confront the reality that Kevin's symptoms had been entirely fabricated and that her protective instincts had been manipulated by someone capable of extraordinary deception. The sentencing phase allowed Kevin's attorney to present mitigating factors that might reduce his prison time, but the evidence of premeditation and systematic planning made his fraud particularly serious in the eyes of federal sentencing guidelines. His elaborate preparation for permanent identity abandonment demonstrated that he had never intended to face consequences for his crimes. Mr. Morrison's fraud was not an impulsive decision or a momentary lapse in judgment. Judge Nguyen observed during her sentencing remarks, "The evidence shows sustained deception over nearly a year involving multiple agencies and victims, with sophisticated preparation for avoiding prosecution through permanent flight." Kevin's final sentence was 78 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation that would include restrictions on his financial activities and requirements for regular psychological evaluation. The sentence reflected the serious nature of his crimes while providing opportunity for rehabilitation if he demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to behavioral change. The court notes that Mr. Morrison maintained his deceptive performance throughout arrest and initial questioning. Judge Nguyen continued, "His inability to abandon his fraudulent persona even when facing criminal charges suggests a concerning level of commitment to deception that will require intensive supervision upon release." Kevin's allocution statement provided his only opportunity to address the court directly about his crimes and their impact on his victim. His remarks revealed a carefully prepared presentation that acknowledged wrongdoing while minimizing his culpability through claims of emotional distress and financial pressure. "I know what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused," Kevin said, reading from prepared notes that his attorney had obviously reviewed extensively. "I was overwhelmed by medical expenses and scared about my future, and I made terrible decisions that hurt people who trusted me." The statement demonstrated Kevin's continued inability to accept full responsibility for his systematic deception. Even while pleading guilty to federal charges, he presented his fraud as the result of circumstances beyond his control rather than calculated choices he had made over an extended period. "My own victim impact statement," read aloud by Prosecutor Chen, detailed the comprehensive damage Kevin's fraud had inflicted on my emotional well-being, professional development, and financial security. The statement emphasized that Kevin's deception had involved not just theft of money but systematic psychological abuse designed to make me complicit in my own exploitation. "The defendant's fraud destroyed my ability to trust my own perceptions and judgment." The statement concluded, "He made me believe that questioning his claims would be cruel and unsupportive, while he secretly planned to abandon our marriage once he had accumulated sufficient resources to start over elsewhere." The civil proceedings that accompanied Kevin's criminal prosecution resulted in additional financial judgments that would ensure his complete inability to benefit from his fraud. Asset forfeiture orders seized his photography equipment, camping gear, and accumulated disability payments, while restitution requirements would garnish his future earnings to compensate his victim. Kevin's professional reputation was permanently destroyed by media coverage of his case, ensuring that his fraud would follow him indefinitely and prevent him from victimizing others through similar deception. His case became a training example for medical professionals, insurance investigators, and law enforcement personnel who needed to understand sophisticated mail-injuring techniques. The insurance industry implemented new verification procedures, partly in response to Kevin's case, including requirements for independent medical evaluations and systematic cross-referencing of claims across different jurisdictions. Kevin's fraud had been sophisticated enough to identify weaknesses in existing detection systems while providing a blueprint for preventing similar deception. My own recovery from Kevin's psychological manipulation required months of therapy focused on rebuilding my ability to trust my own perceptions and judgment. The systematic nature of his deception had created doubt about my capacity to recognize manipulation, but professional counseling helped me understand that his fraud had been designed specifically to exploit normal human compassion rather than personal weakness on my part. Helen remained a close friend whose medical expertise and personal support had been essential throughout the investigation and prosecution. Her systematic documentation had provided the foundation for exposing Kevin's fraud, while her understanding of caregiver psychology helped me process the emotional impact of discovering that my devotion had been systematically exploited. 6 months after Kevin began serving his sentence, I received a letter from him attempting to resume contact and rebuild some form of relationship based on claims of personal growth and genuine remorse for his actions. The letter revealed his continued belief that his manipulation might be effective even after his fraud had been comprehensively exposed and prosecuted. Detective Martinez advised against any response to Kevin's correspondence, explaining that convicted fraudsters often continued their manipulative behavior from prison, while seeking new victims or attempting to re-establish control over previous targets. Kevin's letter demonstrated that his fundamental character remained unchanged despite the consequences he had faced. The financial recovery from Kevin's fraud provided resources that allowed me to rebuild my career and personal life without the limitations his deception had imposed. I returned to full-time graphic design work, established new client relationships, and began developing the professional opportunities I had sacrificed during the months of his fraudulent performance. Most importantly, I developed the ability to recognize manipulation and systematic deception that would protect me from similar victimization in future relationships. Kevin's fraud had been devastating, but it had also taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong and to seek independent verification of claims that seemed inconsistent with observable behavior. The apartment Kevin and I had shared was eventually rented to new tenants, who had no knowledge of the elaborate deception that had unfolded there. I moved to a different neighborhood where I could build new memories uncontaminated by the systematic lies that had defined nearly a year of my life. Kevin's case continued to serve as an example of sophisticated disability fraud long after his conviction, helping other victims recognize similar patterns of deception while educating professionals about advanced mail-injuring techniques. His fraud had been comprehensive enough to fool multiple systems, but ultimately sophisticated enough to ensure his own destruction when subjected to systematic investigation. The man who had spent months pretending to be brain damaged while secretly planning to abandon his marriage was spending actual years in federal prison while genuinely struggling with the consequences of his own choices. His elaborate performance had ended with a very different conclusion than the one he had scripted for himself, but the ending was exactly what justice required. My story had begun with discovering hidden evidence of systematic betrayal, but it concluded with the satisfaction of watching that betrayal receive appropriate consequences while I rebuilt a life based on truth rather than deception. Kevin had taught me to recognize manipulation, and I would never allow anyone to exploit my compassion in such calculated ways again. The journal that had revealed Kevin's fraud became evidence in his prosecution, but it also became the foundation for my own liberation from the psychological prison he had constructed around our marriage. His words, written to document his success, had instead documented his complete failure and ensured that his victims received justice while he received exactly what he had earned through his elaborate cruelty. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.